for this session about working women in the 18th century. Just to introduce myself, my name is Amanda. I am in the 6th year of my apprenticeship here at Colonial Williamsburg, located in southeastern Virginia. If you've never been to Colonial Williamsburg, we are the largest living history museum in the world, and we have the largest historic trades program in the country. So it is my full-time job to learn how to produce and reproduce products made by joiners in the 18th century. Joinery, in a nutshell, is the finished work of a home: doors, windows, mantles, and trims. So we're somewhere between the carpenter that builds your house and the cabinet maker that furnishes it. I myself and my two fellow apprentices, Peter Hudson and Scott Crow, just entered the last level of our apprenticeship. So we'll be journeymen very soon. We're looking forward to that. What does that mean when we become journeymen? That means that we are recognized by Colonial Williamsburg as skilled tradespeople. We get papers, which look a lot like a diploma. We have a little party. We get a bit of a raise, new business cards. And then it's our job to train the next generation of apprentices. So when I define my job, I don't say woodworker first. I say historian first, and then interpreter, and then woodworker, because a big part of my job is working and explaining it to the public, and also researching the 18th century and work done in that period. So my research focus, and I've kind of honed in as I've been here over the last 6 years, I've kind of tuned into women's work in the 18th century, the work of Black Virginians, both free and enslaved, and members of the LGBTQIA+ community in the trades workforce. So that's where my focus is currently. I really enjoy it. And one of the coolest parts of my job is that we are really reconstructing buildings here in Colonial Williamsburg. And a lot of people are very surprised by that. Can everybody see my PowerPoint and my split screen? I think. All right. So this is some images of that reconstruction that I mentioned. So in the top left corner, we see excavation of the coffee house. The coffee house was completed in 2009, and you can see two images of that reconstruction on the top center and right. It is really interesting to be part of the workforce that's not only interpreting the work of the 18th century and using the tools, but really reconstructing buildings here. So there are two photos of me at work. At my bench, we make a lot of shavings, and the project that we just completed, that's a photo of my sash. From that project, we just worked to replace, see, it's 10 sashes altogether for one of our original buildings, the John Saunders House. That was kind of the apex of our apprenticeship, the hardest thing we've built so far. And I'll tell you more about current projects at the end of the program. So why did I choose joinery? I've always been interested in architectural history. I think that buildings tell a story. They tell you a lot about a people and a period. They tell you what is important to them, what is not important to them. And I've always been interested in community spaces. I love working with my hands, and I believe in the power of museums. So that's what brought me here to Colonial Williamsburg. Now, being a person that identifies as a woman, as a joiner in a historic site, has its own challenges. I am by no means the first or only woman to do this work in Williamsburg over the course of the last 300 years, or in Colonial Williamsburg as an institution since we've been open in the 1930s. Over the last few decades, Colonial Williamsburg has made a concerted effort to tell a more inclusive story. We actually just recently celebrated 40 years of African American interpretation at Colonial Williamsburg. So we're very proud of the diverse trades workforce that we have. We're working to make it even more diverse, and people like myself, we research that diversity. It can be very challenging. People are very surprised to see me working with my hands in the joinery, like what you see in those two photographs. Upon my hiring, myself and the former master joiner, Ted Boscana, he's now the director of historic trades and skills at Colonial Williamsburg. He's very graciously let me use his office for this presentation. So thank you, Ted. Upon my hiring, Ted and I talked about it, and we knew it was going to be a challenge, interpreting women's history inside a space where we're already interpreting something else. I don't think either of us knew how challenging it would be. It's rewarding, absolutely. I don't think we understood just how much of a topic of discussion my gender identity would be. There are some days where the topic of women's history and women's work in the 18th century lands itself right in the center of the interpretation of the shop. So we've had to navigate that over the last few years. I'm going to touch on that a little bit later, but for now, I'd like to set the stage for economic history in Virginia in the 18th century. To understand why the presence of women in the shop is unsurprising to the 18th century eye, we have to unpack colonial economics. I'm going to give you the quick and dirty version. Often when we envision the typical colonial American family or experience, we envision the life of someone who is gentry, like what we see here in these photographs. We have Governor Spotswood in the middle, we have Peyton Randolph to the right. The gentry are the free white wealthy, the top 5 to 10% of wealth in the 18th century. That means if they were alive today, they'd be called millionaires, billionaires. They'd be taking SpaceX vacations. To give you a point of reference, these folks are hobnobbing with Washington, Jefferson, Henry. And when George Washington dies, he's worth 1/6 of 1% of the national GDP. If George Washington was alive today and worth that much, he would be worth over $32 billion with a B. That means he is wealthier than the owners of Samsung, Dyson, and Hermes combined. That is exceptional wealth. That kind of wealth supports a family. That kind of wealth means one person can work. That's kind of how we get this patriarchal idea of how families function. The woman stays home and runs the house. The man collects the revenue. Sure. If you're Peyton Randolph, that's how that works. You're also raking in the equivalent of millions of dollars from your one job, and that supports your family. My point is that the history we often tell at historic sites, in public history public history curriculums and public and private school curriculums, highlights this free white wealthy, this gentry class, and that skews the image. That, going to museums like Colonial Williamsburg, where you tour the homes of the incredibly wealthy, makes you think, well, gosh, everybody lived like this in the 18th century. I don't see anything else around here, and this isn't so bad. That's just simply not reality. We cover this class of individual, this gentryman, almost exclusively. It gilds the existence of the 18th century and omits from the narrative the voices of many people, the vast majority of colonial families, including the most common financial situation for free white people, agricultural families, and the middling sort. I'm going to use the middling sort, that phrase, over and over again. And what I mean by that is kind of lower middle class. There is no squarely middle class in the 18th century. We make a bit more money than agriculturalists, but we're still pretty close to the bottom. Like I've mentioned, wealth disparity is massive in the period. Now, we face the struggle of interpreting largely just visually at Colonial Williamsburg, what we have at our disposal, what the buildings that we can show are homes and businesses of the gentry. We are faced with the challenge of interpreting reality for most Virginians, while that reality is not a structure that they can tour around here. It has been the overarching narrative of historic sites and house museums for decades. We focus on the fortunate rich, and therefore the lives of the larger percentage of the population are never looked at any closer. It's our first job at Colonial Williamsburg to unpack the diversity of financial situations in southeastern Virginia from the jump. The capital city of Virginia, Williamsburg, paints a rosy picture of reality. In a city inhabited by the incredibly wealthy, like I mentioned, Peyton Randolph's house, like we see in the photograph, the governor's palace in the bottom center, of course, Mount Vernon on the left and right sides of the bottom row. This is the life of the gentry, but the gentry in Williamsburg, that's not even the greatest percentage of the population here. 52% of our population of the capital city are enslaved individuals. So I often say to visitors that the homes you tour, the Palace, the Randolph, the Carter, the Everard, these are the candy-coated shell of life in Virginia in the 18th century. The Nougaty Center, that's the middling sort. That's enslaved families, that's agricultural families. Tradesmen are part of that middling sort or lower middle class. Really, the true middle class, like what we think of today in the 21st century, doesn't rise until the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. To give you a point of reference, the typical white Virginian is an agriculturalist making somewhere around 15 to 20 pounds a year. A tradesperson, a journeyman joiner, is going to make 40 or 50 pounds a year. So we're a little bit above that. Peyton Randolph, that guy in the last slide, he once got paid 2,400 pounds for a few months of his work. So yeah, the middling sort is in the middle, but we're awfully close to the bottom. In this slide, we see images of what middling sort life would look like on the bottom row for free white people. We see the type of structure we would live in. That's an image from Great Hope's Plantation in 2015, taken by a great friend of the foundation, Fred Blystone. He's one of the best photographers I've ever met. That's two of my former colleagues, Jen and Emily, leaving one of the clapboard-sided dwellings on Great Hope's Plantation. The average family size is living in a structure like that. It's 6 to 8 people. That doesn't mean mom and dad had 6 kids. These are multi-generational households. Grandma and grandpa might live there, older cousins, aunts, uncles, kids from previous marriages. There's lots of people sharing a space that is largely 1, maybe 2 rooms, very small. It's, again, a clapboard-sided dwelling. It has no foundation. You can see that very clearly in that bottom center image, that it's resting not directly on the earth, but pretty darn close. There is no glass in the windows of these homes. The doors are board and batten doors, like what you see in the image, not raised panel doors like what we see throughout Williamsburg and other historic houses. That's the life of the typical Virginian white family. A story and a half, wooden building, no brick, no glass, 6 to 8 people. You're performing jobs in town to make money, coming to town to be a journeyman, to sell your wares made in your cottage industry or in your itinerant work at the market house, or to a merchant. You're walking to work in the morning as the sun is rising and walking home as the sun is setting. There's lots of other details I could get into, but at the end of the day, that's very different than the gentry life we often focus on and talk about. Simply put, that 30, 40, 50 pounds, that 15 or 20 pounds you make as a tradesman or an agriculturalist cannot feed 8 mouths. So if you can work, you do. And that puts women in the trades. Before I go any further, I would like to note that there is nothing socially preventing women from working in the 18th century. All of the hundreds of words I just told you are setting the stage for the fact that it is socially acceptable for women to work with their hands. Not a lady, not a gentleman, not those gentry folk, but everybody else. We've got to work. So what kind of jobs are we doing? I have some images here, a few that I really like from the 18th century. The one in the middle is admittedly from the 19th century, but these are just a few of the images we have depicting women working, particularly making chairs. I love that photo or image on the right from Cries of London of women repairing chairs. It's something that I do in my job, so I feel a kinship to that image. What kind of jobs are we doing? We're doing everything. We have evidence of women participating in every one of the 22 trades and skills we portray here at Colonial Williamsburg, from blacksmithing to joinery. There are some areas where we don't find women. I said the word, nothing legally preventing women from being in the trades. There are some areas that women legally cannot be. Two of them, clergymen and soldiering. There's two other areas where you don't find women. It's not prevented by law, but we don't see it. And that's lawyering and doctors. Why? Because it is socially acceptable for institutions of higher education, colleges and universities, where you have to go to learn how to be a lawyer or a doctor. It's socially acceptable for those institutions to not accept female students. In fact, the College of William and Mary, which is just down the road, didn't have its first class, a graduating class that had women in it until 1919. So we don't see women as lawyers and doctors, not because they're legally prevented from doing that, but rather it's socially acceptable for those institutions to not accept women. There's also further confusion that leads to kind of this skewed idea that women are not participating in these trades. As I alluded to earlier, visitors are really surprised to see me in the shop because public history, museums, historic sites, history textbooks have excluded the middling sort and the working woman. Why? I often joke that that's because for a long time, women didn't write the history books, but we're working on changing that. But really it's because, and this is based on my research, there are two primary sources that we used for research about women's occupational history for a long time that skewed us in the wrong direction. Let me explain. For a long time, we looked at tax documents and the census. That makes sense, right? It is those forms' job to record occupational history and income history. But there's a couple of problems. It makes sense why these were the Bible for economic history, but they don't do women any favors. The rub is that most women are not accurately recorded. What do I mean? For decades and decades of American history, married women could not own property. Unmarried women could. And we have lots of evidence of women, unmarried women, running businesses here in town. Margaret Hunter, Jane Vogue, Christiana Campbell, Mary Dickinson. Some of these women were widows. Some of them chose never to marry. But regardless, they could own property because they were unmarried women. But women that were married, or covered women, femme couvert is the word we use for that, they couldn't own property. Money, wages, are counted as property. So when tax data is collected, a married woman's income is not often counted as hers in the tax document. It's counted as her husband's, because even though she earned the income, legally, it is never hers. It's always his. So it makes it look like women didn't work or collect income. But they did. So furthermore, the census skews it not in our favor further, because for a long time, for decades and decades, no matter what your occupation was as a woman, once you got married, your occupation was often listed as housewife, even if you had a job. Your money was never yours, so you're listed as income collecting, 0, and your occupation is housewife, because in this society, in our culture, in the 18th and 19th century, our social narrative dictates that once a woman gets married, even if she has another job, her primary function is to be a housewife. Women are often listed as primary job, mother. She might be collecting income, but her primary job in the eyes of our collective consciousness is to be a housewife and a mother. So that contributes to our lack of information for a long time. So how did we find these women? How did we get to the bottom of this if the tax documents and census documents are unreliable? We have to look other places. One of my favorite places to look is the Virginia Gazette. That is our newspaper, and it has advertisements in it. It also has letters of request, and it has lots of information, lots of women advertising their businesses, lots of women mentioning that they are coming to town with this trade at their disposal. We also are looking at journals. We're looking at written communication. We're looking at ledger books for trades and for local merchants as to who is buying and selling these goods, who is making these goods in these trade shops, who's bringing them to be delivered to Master Greenhow or Master Tarpley. We're also looking at maker's marks too. So another issue is that often masters or mistresses of businesses would mark their final product with a stamp or a paper label that only said the master or mistress's name, the owner of the business. So that excludes a lot of names of people that are making these things, both male and female. So sometimes people will sign those paper labels, and some of those exist. We're also looking at trade cards. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. And we're just having to dive a little bit further and get a little more creative with the sources. Based off of the information that we have and research done by women's historians all over the world, we believe that in the building trades, in the woodworking world, I say building trades, in Virginia, women make up 30 to 35% of that work. That number is probably way higher. We'll never know how much higher it is, but we know that 30 to 35% of the workforce of the building trades in Virginia are women. The figure in England in the period, about 30% as well. Do you think we're making the same amount of money? No. It's really hard to tell how much money women are making in relation to their male counterparts. It is understood that women are to put out the same quantity and quality of work. They're trained formally in apprenticeships. We have written documentation of that. We're seeing lots of runaway ads for apprentices, and females are mentioned by name. Women are trained informally. They're members of the family, but they don't have to be. They don't have to be a member of the family to be in one of these trade shops. They're collecting revenue in whatever way they can. So we're having to look in more creative places than just official government documents to get to the bottom of this. Now, in terms of wages, we think that in southeastern Virginia, in the woodworking world, women are making about 60 cents on the dollar. That is very regional, very regional. In New England, it's 80 cents on the dollar. In North Carolina, it's 30 cents on the dollar. Just in other parts of Virginia, it could be 75. So I don't want you to take away that women are making 60 cents on the dollar to a man all the time in the 18th century. That's just the best estimate that we have by picking apart those tax documents, doing things like, okay, well, Joe Schmo is a shoemaker. It says in the tax document he made 70 pounds a year. That's an awfully successful shoemaker in this area. The rest of the shoemakers are making about, 40 pounds a year. So where's that other 30 pounds coming from? Something like that. So I just threw those figures out. Don't quote me on any of that. We do have evidence of names, names of women, largely from guild records in England. I'd like to mention a few of those women now. First, I'd like to take a look at the Worshipful Company of Upholders. You can see their seal in the top left corner. Upholder is an archaic word for upholsterer, and the company includes not only upholstery as a trade, but also manufacture and selling of furniture. Cabinet making, undertaking, soft furnishers, auctioneers, valuers. And in the Worshipful Company of Upholders records, we have lots and lots of women's names. Just to name a few, we have Catherine Harris in 1708, Catherine Wood in 1725, Elizabeth Chapman, 1747, Susan Abell, 1748, Jane Lancaster, 1748, Frances Boughton in 1749. These women are listed as next of kin to deceased business owners, likely working in the shop with that male counterpart and capable of taking over the business after they die. Simply put, these women still had to collect revenue after the male breadwinner passes away. Anne Buck has a surviving trade card. We see that in the top right corner of the slide. I wish that was an image of Anne Buck herself, but alas, that is an image of Queen Anne. Her trade card survives. It's like a business card. She bought and sold furniture as a dealer, which means she had intimate knowledge of the trade. Angelica Kaufman was under the employ of the Royal Academy. That portrait in the bottom right is Angelica Kaufman, and some of her work is to the left on that table edge right there. She painted decoration on furniture, and her style is often referred to as Kaufman style. So she permeates the scene in 18th century furniture making and painting. She works on St. Paul's Cathedral, which is incredible. This is another wonderful story, and it gets a little confusing because everybody in the 18th century, white women and white men, seem to be named Elizabeth, John, James, or William. So there's a few Jameses, but bear with me. Elizabeth Moore takes over the business of cabinet making upon the death of her husband, James. In James's will, he wills to his son, James, my materials of the trade, namely wood and tools, at the election of my wife, Elizabeth. He gives Elizabeth the option to continue the trade, ownership of the tools and materials. That tells me Elizabeth worked in the trade. He entrusts her with his business. The plot thickens. So James Moore's business partner, John Gumbley, when he dies, entrusts his business to his mother to continue. Writes a similar will, leaving the tools and materials of his trades to his mother. So these two business partners entrust the remainder of their trade to the linchpins of their life, wife and mother. Now, Catherine Naish is one of my favorite stories of women working in wood in the 18th century. If you know anything about furniture building and or antique furniture, you've probably heard the name Thomas Chippendale. He is a humble man. It's a joke. He's not humble at all. Chippendale is a cabinet maker, and he's very famous for his work. And he's not humble at all. When his shop burns down, he advertises in a paper asking for help to build him a new shop, supply him with new tools, because he thinks it's a crime that the world is without Chippendale furniture after the shop burns down. So again, he knows he's good. But Catherine Naish, or Naish, N-A-I-S-H, accomplishes something Thomas Chippendale never does: royal patronage. She builds a 4-poster bed, split wicker cradles, and 12 mahogany chairs for King George III. The chairs still reside in Buckingham Palace. And in the top center photograph, you see 2 of those chairs built by Catherine's hand for King George III. That's pretty cool. Another favorite is Alice Hepplewhite. Again, if you've studied any antique furniture making or traditional woodworking, you've probably heard the name Hepplewhite before. George Hepplewhite is the name that most people have heard. A lot of people haven't heard about Alice, but really, she really pushes this business forward. Alice is the force behind the business. After George dies in 1786, Alice carries on the business to great success. She publishes The Cabinet Maker and Upholsterer's Guide. We see the cover here on the right, one of her drawings in the center, and kind of the interior of that book on the left, and then the title page. She publishes The Cabinet Maker and Upholsterer's Guide in 1788, 2 years after the death of George. There's lots of new drawings in there, penned by her hand. And the books have no mention of George. They are so well received that 3 more editions are published. Now, if we look closely, the cover on the right, which is the most common cover if you purchase The Cabinet Maker and Upholsterer's Guide, says it was written by who? George Hepplewhite. The 3rd edition of 1794, that's 8 years after the death of George Hepplewhite. He's quite active in the afterlife. I think that's a terrible disservice. I wish Alice had her name on the front. If we look at the title page on the left at the bottom, we can see that it says by A. Hepplewhite and Company, Cabinet Maker. I love that. I just wish she was on the cover. Now, she also achieves royal patronage. Alice Hepplewhite builds chairs with stuffed backs, those chairs in the center there, for His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales. That's plate 10 in the center there from The Cabinet Maker and Upholsterer's Guide. As much as these examples excite me, and I love to mention them, and I love to bring them out in my interpretation, giving someone a name really personifies a story of the 18th century. But I think sometimes if we only focus on giving out certain names, it paints the picture of exceptionalism. It makes it sound like there were just these women doing it. And that's not the case. There are lots of women doing this work that will never know their name, like I mentioned earlier. But it is wonderful to have, hard and fast names and images to go to. Economic historian Claudia Golden describes women's industrial participation in this U-shaped bend. We see 2 of those graphs on the left side of the slides here, one from 1980 and one from 1985. I know that's a bit later than the period I interpret, but nonetheless, they show that same idea. How she explains it is that as incomes rise, when incomes are extremely low, women are in the workforce to a great extent. So that one peak of the U. As incomes rise, often because of new technology or expansion of the market, participation rates fall. Then, as women's education improves and the value of our time increases, we creep back up in participation rates. So this U-shaped pattern, that's how I like to paint the picture to visitors. We often say that history is cyclical. I don't like that. Not when we're talking about women's history. I like to think of women's history as swinging on a pendulum, that U shape. Sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's really bad. I like to think of the last quarter of the 18th century as somewhere kind of in the middle. We're kind of the ebb tide right now. Things are about to change dramatically for women in industry. But in the 18th century, like I said, most free white families have to have women working. So I think it's important to note that participation rates of women in industry are also affected by public policy. They're affected by freedoms in society. They are affected by their own household. They are affected by their faith. A lot of things affect a woman's place in the workforce. This leads me to a very important point, and I've alluded to this a little bit so far. The 18th century does not equal the 19th century. Students of history are shaking their heads like, duh. But I think we kind of combine those 2 centuries as the early America, right? But the 18th and 19th century couldn't be any different anymore. It couldn't be more different in terms of industry, right? In the 19th century, we have the Industrial Revolution. We have big business boom. The rise of the true middle class occurs, an increase in incomes, a revolution in manufacturing, new technologies. It is a shift to heavy machinery, to big business, and this is pushing women out of the workforce. The social narrative, the collective consciousness is shifting not in the favor of women. Does that mean we stop working? No. As you can see here, there's two images of women working in factories on the bottom. The very top, I love that photo. That's a picture around the turn of the 20th century, which are Black women from my area in a woodworking class. Women still put their hands to the work, but societally, it's frowned upon. We still have to work. A lot of women still have to work, but more families can function off of a single income with industry boom. And the 19th century is kind of the image that ignites, that is ignited when we think about the American dream and American history, right? Steel and big business and Rockefellers and Vanderbilts. It's the American dream. Our American dream, our melting pot, all of our cultural identifiers are solidified in the 19th century, and we kind of collude the 18th and 19th century when they're very, very different. The term melting pot has since fallen out of favor in the historic community, and we prefer to think of it as a salad bowl these days, because it's not everybody melting together, it's identities remaining unique, but living in the same area. I think this narrative of exclusion of women from the workforce is completely false. It's wrong on many levels. Not only is it exclusive to the rich and fortunate and white, once again, but it's a story built on the backs of the less fortunate, a period of rampant misogyny, racism, poverty, and classism. And that's why we study history, right? So we get the full story. So what makes my job challenging? Everything that I just said. Unpacking all of that in the average time span I have with the visitor, which is 10 minutes. My site is free flow. So I get about 10 minutes with each visitor before, they decide it's time to move on. A lot of people come in with the preconceived notion that I shouldn't be there, that I'm somebody's wife, I'm their sister, I'm their daughter. And when they see me sweeping, they think that's okay. When they see me pushing a plane, they think something's wrong there. I mentioned lots of women by name, but again, there's countless women, we'll never know their name. Hundreds, thousands of women who devoted their time, their skill, their energy to trades and never got the credit they deserved. So how does it make my job more difficult? I don't know the name of every woman who participated in joinery in the 18th century. And I think also, first of all, we have to unpack joinery and what it is as a trade. And then we have to unpack the box of women participating. I think it challenges the visitor. It challenges them if they identify as a man. It challenges their idea of femininity. And for someone that identifies as a woman, it challenges their idea of what they think they can do, of what they think our history is. That's a confrontation that a lot of visitors don't think they're going to get on vacation, is redefining the roles of women historically. But that's why I do what I do. It can be stressful. Often it is received really well and with the tone of pleasant surprise. Sometimes not so great, but that's okay. We gotta meet our visitors where they are. Again, we have to reevaluate the views of women historically, because we have always been an important part of America's economy. We are a major part in the economic foundations of America. We've worked with our hands. We've helped build these buildings. We've built the industry that made these men very, very wealthy. So the work continues, the research continues. I still have a lot to learn, a lot to read. Every day, I'm trying to absorb some new piece of information. Some sources that I really love, I mentioned the Virginia Gazette. If you're interested in learning more, I highly encourage you to check out The Invisible Woman by Isabel Bandino, Women, Gender, and Industrialization in England by Katrina Honeyman, and The Struggle for Breeches, Gender in the Making of the British Working Class by Anna Clark. Currently in the shop, I am working on building a coffin. It's very morbid. I know Halloween just passed, but this is going to be a piece that's used by our historic interiors for when we have temporary exhibits about what funerals look like. So I am currently reading Women and the Material Culture of Death by Maureen Goggin and Beth Tobin. I've really, really enjoyed this book. I highly encourage everyone to check it out. And also Ann Lister's diary. I've rambled on and on for a really long time. I could talk about this for hours and hours. It's something that means a lot to me and something I've devoted my career to. But at this point, we have about 15 minutes left. So I'd like to turn it over to any questions that we have. I would like to mention some of the sources for my images on here. Again, Fred Blystone, Mr. Chang, Donald Held, Lost Art Press. These images were largely borrowed. There were a few that were my own, but most of them I borrowed from the internet. So I'd like to thank those sources. And with that, I will turn it over to Q&A.
Yeah, so you can type into the chat or into the Q&A box for questions, and I will pop them up on the screen.
Okay.
So just, yeah, feel free to type in any questions you have, and I'll read them out and let Amanda handle them. Thank you so much. This was fantastic.
No, it's a little all over the place. I get very excited.
I understand that. Happens to the best of us.
Michael Knight, I see that you're watching. Hi, thank you.
Yes, thank you to Michael Knight, one of our board members and also one of our Millwright shop staff that attended a conference a couple years ago and met Amanda there and said you should get a hold of her and get her to speak. She's fantastic, is doing some incredible work. So, yeah, thank you to Michael too.
I'd also like to give a shout out to my fellow women in trades across the country and right here at Colonial Williamsburg. I am in almost all of our trades. We have women working, and they inspire me every day to keep my head up, keep doing research. They're amazing resources. So thank you to my wonderful colleagues and my male counterparts that support me every day too. Question.
Wow, everybody must be sleepy this afternoon.
Yeah.
Oh, wait. Let's see. All right. Was there a difference in women in the trades by religion? For example, Quakers, were they, I guess, more or less likely to have women in the trades?
Yes, there's always, in terms of people's faith, there's always going to be differences. So when I interpret here at Colonial Williamsburg, I make it pretty clear when I'm talking about women in 18th century, I'm talking about women in 18th century Virginia that are members of the Church of England, that are free and they are white. Of course, we interpret the Black Virginian experience and Indigenous experience. But in terms of faith, the Quakers do have lots of women that are performing the work as well. In fact, I like to pull this out a lot, that the first table saw that is powered by a mill is invented by a Quaker woman in the first quarter of the 19th century. So women are participating in the work in Quakerism as well. In other sects of Christianity, like Moravians and things like that, I'm not sure. But I'm fairly certain that in most faiths, women are participating. That rate will fluctuate though.
Let's see. What did women do with their children while they worked?
Excellent question. So it's a lot like today. When you get pregnant, you work until you can't. You go home, you have your children, and you return to work as soon as you can. Now, if you are part of the family business, you don't have to be somebody's daughter. Maybe it's your uncle or your aunt's business or a really close friend. You would bring the child with you to work, especially to nurse. But if you can't, there's going to be someone in your family unit that is capable of watching your child more than likely. Again, multi-generational households could be an older child, an older cousin, aunts or uncles, grandma and grandpa. And we are also putting responsibilities on children a lot younger. Kids are starting their apprenticeship around 11, 12, 13. So if you are responsible enough to enter the workforce, we also view you as responsible enough to watch a child. Now, that being said, if you can't bring your child to work and you have no one else in your household to watch your kids, there are some women that their form of income, their collection of revenue is watching other people's kids. Remember, most people, like I mentioned, are not living in the metropolitan area. We're living a mile or two outside the city in small farming and trades communities. We're surrounded by people of the same economic class. So there's likely somebody in your direct vicinity who takes on that role of watching people's children during the day. I still have one of those in my neighborhood now. There's a woman whose job it is to watch all the neighborhood kids. So there would be someone to watch your children, absolutely. If not, you would have to shift to a cottage industry, meaning you would have to do something out of the home and sell those goods in the city. Just like today, you know, there's lots of different ways that households are dual income households or multiple income households. You just have to make it work. That's been the story of women's history since the beginning.
Our director, Tony Shahan, asks if in your research, have you found any reference to women millwrights? We have been looking for evidence and have not been successful so far.
I have not, only because I haven't looked into a lot of mills. Because we don't have a ton in the area, to be honest. A lot of the mills in Virginia are west of Richmond. We have a couple of tide mills, but I will look. And if I find anything, you'll be the first to know.
Awesome. A follow-up on the religion. Did Shaker women make Shaker furniture, since that sect was known for its furnishings?
Yes. The short answer is yes, absolutely. You know, Shaker furniture is kind of ubiquitous with early American furniture making. So kind of take everything I said about Church of England, Southeastern Virginia, and equate that to Shakerism. Women are absolutely working with their hands. To my knowledge, that is part of their faith, is kind of industry and making things. And being self-sufficient and things like that. I don't want to misquote anything, but yes, Shaker women are working as well. That is very regional too, how accepted it is in different Shaker cultures, but I know Shaker women are working. Mm-hmm.
Let's see, we have a question. Is there any record of enslaved women in the trades, or is this something that's lost to history because they're being considered property themselves?
I haven't seen that. I haven't seen evidence of enslaved women in the trades. That doesn't leave me convinced that there were none. The building trades, actually, so in terms of enslaved Africans and African Virginians, way more than half of their fates are resting in the agricultural sector. Of the other occupations that enslaved individuals are put to, the largest group are the building trades. 52% of the remainder of enslaved individuals are devoted to the building trades. We have lots of names of enslaved men working in the building trades. In particular, we talk a lot about Nat and Jerry, who are owned by Humphrey Harwood, a local builder. We say that every original building from the 18th century here in town or elsewhere were built by Black hands. Absolutely. We don't have the names of a lot of enslaved individuals in general. Those names are lost because you're absolutely right. They are not viewed as human. They are viewed as property. Their names are lost. A lot of women, enslaved women, are performing domestic duties. We have lots of names of women that are doing that. Again, that doesn't leave me convinced that women aren't involved in joinery and putting their hands to the tools as well. I would love to have their names. I'm going to keep looking because I like to speak their names. We're still looking. We're still looking.
Michael Knight asks, he says, Williamsburg is known for the formalized trades apprenticeship process. As a joiner, what is the progression of skills that lead to journeyman status? Like, do you have a skills checklist or a specific curriculum?
Yeah, we do. We have a curriculum. It's different trade to trade around here. For us and the joinery, it's project-based, not skills-based. In the projects, you are building skill upon skill. So we jokingly call the first year of the joinery apprenticeship the year of the box, because you're building a lot of boxes and drawers and candle boxes and sliding tops and stuff like that. Because the skill you're learning there, it's really hammering home, pun intended, the necessity of boards having to be flat and square. If the boards are not perfectly flat and square, there's no such thing as flat-ish. The box is going to be a trapezoid. The drawer is not going to run on the track. So that's kind of like the first year. And then from there, we start building more and more complex architectural figures and furniture. So we do have a literal checklist of things we build. So in the final level, it is our journeyman project, which is a Eastern Shore corner cupboard that kind of covers everything in joinery, molding, panel doors, sash windows, carving, all that good stuff. So that's very close in our future. The interesting thing is that there's 3 of us that started our apprenticeship at the same time. So we're all the same place in our apprenticeship curriculum, which is great because we're teaching each other and learning together. But when we're all building the same thing, it looks like we only build tables or we only build corner cupboards. So sometimes we have to unpack that. Currently, we're all building something different, which we love, because I'm building a coffin and Peter's carving and Scott's building a mantle. So it really looks like a lively joinery. But yeah, sometimes it looks like Williamsburg's Chair Emporium in there.
I can imagine it could get confusing if you get pieces from different people's projects mixed together, having done that with sewing before.
Yeah.
Let's see, Kathy wanted to say you are inspiring and your enthusiasm is contagious. This is an area of historical research that will add to better understanding of the work women did, the how, what, where, why of the use of women's time and lives, as well as what came of their earned income. And Pamela says, many years ago, she did the Mesda Summer Institute. Her paper was on women craftsmen in the Chesapeake, and there were plenty of them. And also says, your talk was so very good, with a lot of exclamation points.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
That is all the questions that I see that we haven't answered yet. If anybody has a last question, speak now, but I assume you can be contacted through Colonial Williamsburg Foundation if people have
if you come up
follow-up.
with any questions. Yeah, if you want to follow up, my email address is really easy. It's Doggett, Doggett @cwf.org. I'm more than happy to share sources or just talk to you about this, as it's something I'm really, really passionate about. So yeah.
Here, I'll type that into the chat. There we go.
Thank you, Laura.
And we have another, many thanks, Amanda. So good to see you again. That's Jan Knight, Michael's wife. I must admit, I was one of the surprised visitors, learn something new every day.
Yeah.
All right, well, we will close it out now, but thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you to everybody who attended our Newlin series programs this season. Again, this one will be posted along with the others up on our website shortly, and we will have a calendar for the next season coming to you soon. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.